Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Culture Bite Lunches, Hillingdon Libraries' fast, fun and friendly daytime author interviews. I hope you're all doing well as we adjust to another week of changes in our lives. Today we have a great interview for you for fans of fantasy writing, queer books and rom-coms, because our guests' books manage to combine all three of those things into one page-turning series. It is, of course, Ry Herman, author of Love Bites and its brand new sequel, Bleeding Hearts. Hi, Ry.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're very, very grateful for your time. So Ry's debut novel, Love Bites, came out last summer. It's this one. And introduced us to his main characters, Chloe and her undead love interest, Angela. And now he's followed it up with a sequel, Bleeding Hearts, in which Chloe and Angela are an established couple racing against time to try and cure Angela's vampiric tendencies. Ry has a theatrical background, including playwriting and performing at the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, and he lives in Scotland. So, Ry, we've tended to start our interviews by asking how people have been doing during COVID times. You've managed to draw the short straw in a way because you've had 2 books published since the first lockdown. How have the past 16 months been for you?
Oh, they've varied a bit. They've been up and down. In some ways, I feel like I've had the pandemic on easy mode in some ways because I'm a writer and I work at home anyway. So I didn't have all the difficulties with either having to shift over from working from home or not being able to go to work at all or losing my job or any of those problems. But on the other hand, I think the pandemic has been stressful for everyone, myself included. And there have been definite periods when I've felt the stress and the inability to go to stores, the inability to have people come in and get things repaired in my flat, and just the existential dread of a pandemic happening in the world. So there have been periods where, I've been fine. There have been other periods when there was a period last year where I just did not write for several months. I just couldn't. Eventually, I just started reading fairy tales all day until I was inspired again and started writing again. So it's been mixed.
Yeah, I mean, quite a few writers have told us that writing was a struggle and that reading was a struggle. I think a lot of us found that at the time. And presumably, so Love Bites came out pretty soon after we kind of went into lockdown. And were you working on Bleeding Hearts quite a bit during last year kind of thing?
Yes. Bleeding Hearts, actually, I was doing final edits on it just as lockdown started. And because I had a sort of a set project to work on, because I had something solid, I need to edit this book. It wasn't sort of starting something new. At first, I was doing very well. I was progressing, working as normal. And then when that finished, I expected to turn to the next project as usual. And that's when I found, oh, that's not it. You've managed to suppress the stress until now, but now it is all coming out. And having a book published, having Love Bites come out just at the beginning of that, that was my debut novel. And now this year, a lot more is online. People have sort of adjusted. But then I had all sorts of events I was supposed to do, all sorts of things I was going to do, and they were all canceled. So sort of my experience as a debut novelist ended up being everything that debut novelists normally get to do. Yeah, you don't. Your book is just going to be flung screaming into the empty void, and it does. So that disconcerting and a bit of a strain.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you came at just at that wrong point where you kind of planned for it to be appearing in a different world, kind of thing.
And last year it was sort of, well, it came out in July, I think, and there were events in August. And in June, we were thinking, well, maybe by August we'll be having live events again. And then it sort of, well, maybe by September we'll be having live events again. And it sort of got pushed back and back and back until there was a sort of tipping point where everyone kind of realized, yeah, nothing's going to happen for a while.
Yeah, we're just kind of there again, aren't we? Where we're wondering, can we hope that we might be back to something a bit more normal before too long? Yeah. Anyway, before we get too much further, for anyone who's watching who hasn't read the books yet, could you start by telling us a little bit about Love Bites and Bleeding Hearts in your own words?
Okay, Love Bites is fantasy girl meets girl romantic comedy. About a vampire who does not want to be a vampire. Her ex-girlfriend turned her into one. And she has been spending her time alone, not trying to beat any people, trying to drink blood surreptitiously. But then she meets someone. So Angela Vampire meets Chloe, and romance sparks until, of course, things go wrong. The sequel is set a year later when they have been in a relationship for a year. They've worked things out. But the problem is Angela is still a vampire. She's been drinking from Chloe, and they know very little about vampires because as soon as Angela was turned into one, she fled. And they've come to realize that if Angela keeps drinking from Chloe, Chloe is probably going to die. So they start a frantic search for a solution to this. They think they may have to break up. Angela doesn't know what she's going to do. She has to stop drinking blood altogether and go cross country, and both have magical experiences. Angela meets older vampires who do not turn out to be nice people, especially one of them. Chloe, who is starting to come into her own as a witch at that point, has a mystical journey through magical Boston, and they attempt to solve their difficulties.
And everyone who kind of writes vampire fiction has to come up with their own take on vampires and decide, I guess, what the rules are for their version. And you have a chapter quite early on in Love Bites where Angela writes about some of the features of her particular type of vampirism. So how did you decide how your particular vampire lore was going to work?
Well, I'll start by saying that was a fun chapter to write because Angela is a scientist. In the first book, she's a graduate student in astrophysics, and she has a very scientific viewpoint. So she tests herself to see, so what is vampirism? How does it work? And it's sort of driving her mad because it makes no sense, because she knows science and she knows she should have a reflection, and she doesn't. And there's no physical mechanism which should allow for that. So some of the things I chose were because I wanted to play with that idea of someone with a modern scientific mindset having this experience which completely does not make sense, which violates physical laws in a way she knows, destroy everything, destroy causality, destroy physics, destroy everything she knows about the universe, and her trying to grapple with that. So I picked some things from traditional vampire lore which do that, like her not having a reflection. In general, I wanted to stick to some extent with sort of the traditional vampire mythology as it's come down since about the middle of the 19th century, the most well-known one, because I wanted it, among other things, I wanted it to be a serious problem for her. I wanted her to need to drink human blood and not necessarily be able to, there are books where you can drink out of blood bags or you can use animals, and there are ways around it so you can sort of be a vampire in a way that's harmless. And I didn't want to do that because I wanted it to be a serious problem that she had to solve and couldn't find an end run around in any, convenient way. There are some aspects of vampire mythology I'm actually sad I didn't get to use. There's a vampire legend that vampires sort of have a form of obsessive compulsive disorder, so that if you spill rice in front of them, it's a way to stop them because they have to stop and count all the grains. And that was one I wasn't able to work into the story, have always regretted, and have wondered if at some point I could use that elsewhere.
Yeah, that would have been really good because it would have kind of tied in, I guess, with the kind of themes of mental health you've got in there
Yes.
already, I think. And I liked in that chapter in particular, she does a kind of calculation, doesn't she, about that kind of proves that if everyone who was bitten by a vampire turned into a vampire, everyone would just be vampires very, very quickly. Is that something you kind of came up with? My mind was blown. So vampires just couldn't really exist.
Yeah, that was another thing, because she did the math. It was like, why is everyone in the world not a vampire? If it's transmitted through biting and they bite people, that's an exponential progression.
Yeah, it's like a bit like what's happening with COVID at the moment, kind of thing. It's just all, yeah, no, I was taken aback. Did you kind of just come up with? Is that something that had bugged you about vampires before? Kind of.
Well, it's not exactly something that bugged me, but I like, because I love fantasy is the genre I love reading, and I love accepting things that don't necessarily make, absolute sense in terms of how does the physical world work? How would this play out? I can accept a lot of things. I can roll with a lot. But for someone like Angela, who thinks of things very scientifically, who wants to know what this means, this is something that would have occurred to her. This is something that she would have tried to work out. I just had this vision of her, pounding her head against her computer keyboard saying, it doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. And that, in fact, can be contrast with Chloe, especially in the second book, who has a more intuitive approach to the supernatural and magic, and in a certain way is willing to roll with things more and be more like, okay, this is something that happened, I accept it. And part of the second book is them learning to appreciate each other's approaches in that way, and the advantages both have, and that there's room for both the intuitive and the logical when dealing with the world. I think it's, on a slightly different note, I think it's, you mentioned mental health, which is, of course, a big part of the books. For romantic comedies, they do deal with some fairly serious topics. They deal with depression. They deal with the fact that Angela's first relationship with the woman who turned her into a vampire was a very abusive relationship, and she's dealing with the after effects of that throughout both books. And that was another reason, to bring it back a little, that I chose some of the aspects of vampirism that I did. Because in part in the books, they're a metaphor for the issues that come up in the book. The way vampirism spreads, I partly wanted to talk about how being abused can make you feel like you're a monster. How abusers flip the script on you and make you think you're the one in the wrong. Everything is your fault. And so Angela, having been turned into a vampire by her abuser, spends much of these books thinking, I'm terrible, I'm a monster, I'm destructive, and has to learn that isn't necessarily the case, that what she has become does not determine who she is as much as she thought it did.
And you've actually called the series the most autobiographical work I've ever written, which might surprise people given how fantastical it is. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. Love Bites especially is about as autobiographical as it is possible for a love story with vampires to be, which means it is not, of course, entirely autobiographical. But some of the aspects, such as dealing with depression, such as coming out of an abusive relationship, and certain things which are taken directly from my life, such as the fact that I met my spouse in a goth club in the 90s and had a very similar conversation as the one that happened in the book. And our first date was to go watch a meteor storm up on a mountain in the dead of winter. And so I definitely drew from my own life. And the more the book was revised, the more I wrote it, the further it got from being me. So I would not say this character is me, this other character is this other person. But there's definitely, I wanted to use my own experience. There were things I wanted to talk about that had happened to me in my life. And writing it in a very autobiographical way was a very good way to get those points across, because I could speak from direct experience of having been abused, of having been depressed, of finding love again after that and moving to a very different relationship.
And I mean, are there any kind of pitfalls about writing a character who's sort of partly based on yourself?
There always are. I think it's well known the dangers of what's sometimes called the self-insert character, that you can be tempted to make them, I am going to write myself, but a bit smarter and a bit better looking and a bit nicer. And suddenly you have a character that everyone loves except for villainous people who kick puppies, and even they come around to loving them eventually. So there's always the danger of writing yourself just a little bit too perfect and not putting in any of your flaws. And so that is something I tried to avoid, because I think everyone has that temptation. I think the one I may have fallen for is I may have made the character a bit wittier than I am, because I am very much a writer, and I think of witty things I could have said in a conversation 2 days after the conversation. And part of the joy of writing is you can have the character actually say those in the moment and have that little bit of being smarter in that particular way. I thought I could allow that.
I think readers like that kind of witty sort of dialogue and things like that, don't they, as well? And what made you decide then to make both your main characters women? Because I've seen as well that you wrote that was there was a joy to that.
Yes.
And were there any challenges from that point of view?
Well, my gender is what I might call a work in progress. I am genderqueer, which is a rather umbrella definition, and exactly what that means to me, I am still exploring. And these books were, in retrospect, I think, one method I used to explore my own gender. Sort of, who am I? And in fact, writing that way was not a challenge. It was writing a character like me was one of the easiest things I've ever done. And so I felt like that in itself taught me a lot about my own internal gender, that writing the character in this way, writing them as two women, was not a stretch for me at all. So I feel like, if nothing else, I learned some things from that.
That's really interesting. And I was also kind of interested that you'd set the book in the 90s. Was that just kind of part of the sort of autobiographical part of it, or was there another reason? And go on.
Sorry. It is a bit in part the autobiographical part, because the late 90s were where these events I was talking about were occurring. The abusive relationship I mentioned was in the mid 90s, and then meeting another person happened sort of at the cusp of the millennium. So that was in fact part of it. So because that's when these things happened. It was also, however, I will say, because that was the height of goth club culture. which I was part of. And as I mentioned, when I talked about meeting this new person, that was in a goth club in Boston, that conversation. And so another aspect of vampires I really wanted to work with was the goth way that they're portrayed as dressing, the attitude towards the concept of vampires that goth clubs fostered in a way, which had, repercussions in the culture for years after they stopped being such a major thing. And so that was something I wanted to play with, the idea of vampire as goth, because Angela, in a way, finds herself almost being forced to be goth. And again, it's like, does this make sense? Is this something I actually enjoy, or do I have some kind of goth instinct because I'm a vampire? And it's also because I was a goth club habitué in the 90s and I miss them now.
I was going to ask, actually. So a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for the 90s, and it's kind of come back round again more recently, which of course everything does. Were the 90s a utopian golden age, or are we looking at them through rose-colored glasses like everything else?
I wouldn't call them a utopian golden age. I think there are ways we've moved forward from then and ways we've moved backwards. In Bleeding Hearts, I talk a bit about the political situation in the U.S. At the very end of the 90s, with the beginning of in 2000, actually, with the election that was going on, and in which George W. Bush versus Al Gore, and the repercussions that eventually had for queer rights. And I think in a lot of ways, one thing I've noticed is that queer fiction in science fiction and fantasy, it was almost unfindable in the 90s. There are a couple books I can think of, Swords Point by Ellen Kushner or Slow River by Nicola Griffith, a few others. But when you came across one, if you were looking for that kind of thing, as I was, it was sort of like, I found a unicorn, I found one. And now, starting about 7 years ago, there's been a real change. Queer characters and themes have really entered the mainstream of science fiction and fantasy in a way they just weren't 20, 30 years ago, in a way where they're not coded, they don't have to be villains, they don't have to die, they're just there. And so I think that's a wonderful piece of progress. All that having been said, yes, I still do miss goth clubs. I read an article a few years back which noted that of all the various subcultures, older goths are the ones who are most likely to be like, oh yeah, still goth. Even if there's no clubs anymore where they live, even if their mode of expression is now a black T-shirt, that identification is still there for as goths grow old.
And it's really interesting to hear you talk about how there's just a lot more kind of queer representation in books now than there was before. Do you have any kind of favorites of this sort of renaissance that we've been having from that point of view? And are there any kind of genres that particularly represent well, or others that maybe don't have such good representation, do you think?
Oh, wow. I have so many favorites. It's almost difficult to separate them out. The Elemental Logic series by Laurie J. Marks, which is actually one that the first book I think may have been in the 90s or possibly the early 2000s, but the last book of that just came out recently, and that's a wonderful series.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's really interesting. Is there a sense of that the author had more permission as time went on to include different things in such
I actually don't think so for that particular one. I think that was one of the rare exceptions, like Slow River, which was queer right from the get-go. It hit the ground running, which is one reason I think of it, because it was both groundbreaking and persisted up until the present. So I've some books I've read recently, The Outside by Ada Hoffman, An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. See, I should be able to answer this question easily, but I'm reading so many now because there are so many that I'm almost getting tripped up on. Which ones do I recommend?
That's true. You can very easily have just purely read queer fiction now if you want to, can't you? So
okay. I'm going to pick two, which I'm going to recommend because they're a little more obscure. I don't think they quite had the popularity of some other books, so I want to promote them. One that just came out is Strange Creatures by Phoebe North, which is just an astonishing book, I thought. The fantasy aspects are very subtle, sort of things happen and you go, wait, was that real, or was that just in a character's head? What just happened there? So it sort of sits on the border of genre, which is something I love, things that fall between the cracks, which is, why I write fantasy rom-com adventure books about serious mental health issues. And so that's about a brother and sister who create a magic kingdom that as kids that they play in together. And then one day the brother disappears. And so it's sort of about what happened. So I would recommend that, Strange Creatures by Phoebe North. Another one that should be wider known than it is The Breath of the Sun by Isaac Fellman, which came out a couple of years ago and actually won an award, but still has not been read enough. And that's another fantasy book. This is a secondary world fantasy. It's not on Earth, it's somewhere. And it's about people who live on the slope of a mountain that can't be climbed. You climb it and it just seems to go on up forever. And the people who live at the base of the mountain regard the mountain as God. And it's just a very powerful philosophical work. And both of these works, I haven't emphasized in my description of them that they have queer characters. And I think that's what they do. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the modern iteration of queer science fiction and fantasy. It's that doesn't have to be the central point of the book if it's there anymore. That can be simply a fact about the characters, like they're tall, they have green eyes, they're queer, and it's part of the book, it's part of their character, it's an essential part of them, but the book doesn't focus on this of, let's explore that, let's explore their queerness. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's an amazing thing. I'm very happy about that.
That's really interesting. And those both sound like books that I'll definitely have to check out. One thing we haven't talked about yet is just the whole kind of process of getting your first novel written and published. So Love Bites is your debut, isn't it?
Yes.
So take us back to when you kind of first started writing it. Did you kind of always have a sense that this might be the one? And then how did you go about getting it published?
Okay. So if you want to go back to when I really started writing it, we're going back to the spring of 2002, when I was writing it as a one-act play. And it was quite different in many ways. I had just started a new relationship. I was very excited about it. I was deeply in love. And I had experienced that transition of, recovering from an abusive relationship to moving forward, and really wanted to write about that. And at the time, I didn't think of myself as a novelist. I thought of myself as a playwright. So I wrote a play, and over the years, I kept coming back to it in one way or another. It was just a story that was really a story I wanted to tell. So in some ways, I think this was, was to me the one. This was the story, because there's lots of other things I wrote, in the meantime. Since 2002, I wrote many other plays. I wrote drafts of novellas and novels, but I kept coming back to this one and revising it. So it became a 2-act play. And then I turned it into, my first attempt at writing a novel, which was terrible, because novels are not plays. And I had to learn a completely new method of writing. And there are many differences. There's longer, more has to happen. And even basic things like in a play, you don't generally describe your characters because they could be played by any actor. So you don't want to say, well, this character has to be played by a blonde, unless it's absolutely crucial to the plot, because you want it to be able to be played by anyone. And so my first attempt at a novel, I never described anyone, and at some point realized probably readers will want to know what my characters look like. And the first attempt was very dialogue heavy, because plays are all dialogue, and novels have internal thoughts. They have description of the environment. They have dialogue is only a small part of them, and they progress in other ways. So this was, in some ways, the book I learned to write a novel on. And so I wrote that and put it aside and wrote other things, and then came back to it and rewrote it again and rewrote it again. By the time it was published, I believe this is the 10th draft, which is a little more than many people put into it, but having talked with other writers, not necessarily extreme. I've met plenty of people whose first novel, as they were learning to write it, went through 7 drafts or 8 drafts. And I've met people who went through more drafts than 10. Bleeding Hearts had far fewer drafts, because by then I had learned better from the beginning how to write a novel. So Love Bites was a long process of writing. The process of getting it published was, I think no 2 stories of how people get their first novel published are exactly the same. There's sort of the typical story, the sort of story people who have investigated it, at least, imagine, is that you write your novel and you send it to an agent, and the agent picks it up, and maybe you revise it to the agent, and the agent sends it to publishers, and then the publisher picks it up. And that is not at all what happened with me. I did have an agent for a while, but the agent was working several jobs and had to, pull back from agenting. So I started sending it out myself, and I sent it to all sorts of publishers, and it actually got picked up off the slush pile. It just got picked up, not from an agent unsolicited, which is much rarer, but obviously does happen. And I'm skipping things here because while I had an agent, I had another publisher interested in it, but that fell through, and for various reasons I won't go into here. But it was a very bumpy journey. It wasn't smooth. Okay, it goes, and now it's published. There was a lot of bumps in the road, and I don't think that's unusual, but it's why sort of every journey to publication is different. I worked in publishing, as the character did, in the 90s. And it didn't help me in the way of like having connections or knowing people, because by the time I was, sending this book out, it was 20 years later. And no one I knew had anything to do with publishing anymore, I think. But it did help me in being aware of certain parts of the process that trip up some people submitting their novel for the first time, because I had been on the other side of it. And I had gotten, submission letters, which made me think, is this person insane? just because they're very weird, and possibly just in an attempt to get my attention, as an editor. But it did not work because it got my attention in a bad way. And things like, if a publisher has guidelines, follow those guidelines. A surprising number of people think, well, it says they don't accept anything under 80,000 work, but maybe if I send my 60,000 piece work in, they'll read it and like it. Maybe that's more a guideline than a rule. It's a rule. And that's something I learned as, working in that really those are things that people put there for a reason, and whatever they say, really pay attention to it. And, just knowing that, I don't think it made getting published, finding a publisher easier. Finding a publisher is always difficult, but I think it made the initial process of, okay, I want to send this out. What do I do? What do I write? A little bit smoother. I'm a little bit more like, okay, I at least know what I'm doing in this part because I've read these and I know how to write one which is just normal.
Yeah, a long apprenticeship in how to submit to publishers. Well, we've unfortunately pretty much run out of time.
Oh, already? It's flown by.
Glad we've already gone over. Before we do leave, though, I do have to ask you what you're working on now. I know you've been putting little word count updates on your blog. Are you doing? Will there be a sequel to these two, or is it something completely new?
The one I'm working on now is something completely new. As I mentioned before, I started reading fairy tales during lockdown, just an attempt to find inspiration. And I found the strangest fairy tale collected by the Brothers Grimm called The 12 Huntsman, which is a bizarre story. Just things happen. People put on disguises and you never find out why they bothered to put on disguises because there was no reason for it. There's a talking lion who suddenly appears in the middle of the story and it's never explained, why is there a talking lion? What is the talking lion doing there? So it feels like almost like a movie with, scene missing, explanation not present. And so I read this and thought, I bet I could come up with a fun explanation for all these things that make no sense. And that was sort of the jumping off point for what I'm writing now. It's a retelling of the 12 Huntsmen from the point of view of the most minor character in the story. She shows up at the very end of the story and is told to go away. She's the princess who doesn't get married to anyone. And so I'm like, what did she think of all this? And so that's what I'm working on now.
That sounds really interesting. And I saw on your blog that you've already read In the Dream House.
Oh, yes.
Which I really loved, the kind of fairy tale references in that. And since you've given me some great book recommendations, which I'll run out and buy, I don't know if you've read The Archive of Alternate Endings.
I have not. Wait, who is that by?
It's by Lindsay Drager, I think. Very, very slim little book.
Yes, I have read that one.
Hansel and Gretel and Haley's Comet.
Yes, I have.
Really
yes, that's a wonderful book too. Yeah.
I can't recommend it to them, but we've recommended it to anyone who's watching. Well, thank you so much.
I will also recommend it to anyone who's watching. It's a great book.
Yes. Some great recommendations in this edition. Well, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Ryan. I could talk to you for much longer, especially with all your great knowledge of different queer fantasy books as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. It was lovely to talk to you, and I'm always happy to give book recommendations, and especially for queer science fiction and fantasy, because that is my love.
Fantastic. So just to let everyone else know, as we adjust to the new changes to COVID rules from the 19th, you can expect changes to your library service coming up as we begin to bring you a less restricted offer. And remember, you can just check our website for all the latest details about that. And you can also find listings on there for all our upcoming author events. And if you really, really are keen to see what we have coming up, you can sign up to our email newsletter as well, which we send out every month or so. Thanks again, Ry. Great to see you. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.